a number of you that have joined us today who are friends of CREC. So it's fabulous to note some names out there in the audience that I'm familiar with, which is comforting. So CREC is based physically in central Birmingham, but obviously we're all currently working from home at the moment. You'll be hearing from Chris and Tony later on after a break, and some questions later, and you'll get much more of a feel of the overall work that we do at CREC. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about myself and the context of the research that I carried out, and I particularly want to address with you all what effective professional development looks like, and also have some reflections on my own experience through the years of such professional development. I'm going to, as I've just said, introduce perhaps something new to many of you, pedagogic mediation, and I found it to be an effective professional development mechanism for the early years practitioners that I was working with at the time. And then, perhaps most importantly at the moment, I want to really reconsider that research in light of the situation that we all find ourselves in at the moment. It's been unprecedented, and we use this language, don't we, all the time about the experiences of what's turning into sort of 12 months of global pandemic, sadly. But it has changed things forever, and I'm hoping that by the end of today's presentation there are some ways that we can learn some really valuable lessons from our experiences during lockdown and lockdown Mark 2, and start to sort of move things forward, particularly for those of us in early years. That's where my heart lies. Okay, so before I get you into the nuts and bolts of the actual professional development itself, I am extremely passionate about this element of my work, my personal context, my positionality for those of you that are researchers at the moment. It is so important to acknowledge your connection to the work that you're doing. We're all motivated. Oh, sorry, there we go. Relatively new to Teams myself, much more comfortable in Zoom. Other way around to Tracy. Okay, we are all influenced by our experiences and by the things around us. And the research that I carried out, which I have to say was doctoral level research in terms of pedagogic mediation, that is a culmination of my life's experiences. So you've got an image on the right there of my father and I on a sandy beach in Wales, and he was very, very influential in terms of my early experiences, and particularly in making me politically aware. I'm a great believer in awareness of politics and the influences on our society generally, and it's something that I've brought to my own children, who you can see in the picture above. And my dad from a very early age made me very politically aware, and part of that political awareness was very much around advocacy and voice, and whether or not I could be a good advocate and speak out for those who might not feel confident to speak out or have capacity to speak out for themselves. So it was certainly something that was sort of an embedded value in terms of my early childhood. And it's a value that really influenced me as I then got into my professional career. I went into teaching initially. I went into primary school teaching. I didn't want to be a teacher. Teaching was actually the very last thing I wanted to do, which is interesting given that I came from a huge family of teachers, and teaching was very much part of my own upbringing. So I was not going to be a teacher. I was going to be all sorts of other things, including, a police officer and a vet and everything else in between. I think at one point I was going to be a dancer, but teaching was the bottom of my list, and I stumbled into teaching, actually exploring educational psychology I've done it again. And the notion of becoming an educational psychologist, for which you need to become a teacher first. I got into teaching and I loved it. I mean, there's making no bones about it. I absolutely loved it. So, but once I was in teaching, that political awareness and that passion around advocacy and voice had remained. So when the school that I was working in as a newly qualified teacher was looking for somebody to undertake school council, I was first on the list, and I desperately wanted to be involved in the development of the school council. When it came to linking school councils together across our entire locality, and I was working then in Aston, in Birmingham, we were connecting school councils together across a variety of schools and localities, and we were involved in decision making, as in the children and myself collectively were involved in decision making. But one of the things I always struggled with as a primary school teacher was ensuring that the voice of our youngest children was adequately considered. And very often I had discussions with colleagues around the fact that, no, they're too young. No, we can't include the reception children in that because they're too young. My career progressed and I moved from primary teaching into early years, and that was quite eye-opening for me, and that has really significantly influenced some of the materials that I'm going to present to you today, because all of a sudden I wasn't necessarily a teacher anymore. I was a practitioner, and I use the word practitioner now all the time and readily, rather than necessarily using the term teacher. And we can get hung up on our terminology and sort of really delve deeply into why we're using the language that we are using, and we should do that, and it's right to do that. But I found it interesting that I almost experienced a shift in status, and I did also experience some of the parents asking me about my demotion, and was I unhappy to be moved down to work in early years. And it was very, very interesting to me, having worked predominantly towards the top end of Key Stage 2, I have to say, for a large proportion of my primary career. So being a children's centre teacher, then moving into that sector, I retained my passion about listening to the children, and I wanted our family voice and our children's voice to be very much part and parcel of the development of our children's services in the locality that I was working in. From that perspective, I then did my MA. I was one of CREC students originally, and I know there are a number of the CREC students with us today. I was a CREC student, but that then saw me becoming a researcher, and I started to see myself more as a researcher. And there are many of you that are listening today that would consider yourselves to be researchers. I'd argue that you all are, but we'll talk about that later. And then also, and I've written the term academic, and I'm going to tell you all that I've written it reluctantly, because even though I'm very, very close to the end of a PhD, and I've got quite a few papers and things and book chapters that I've written, and I lead postgraduate provision at CREC, I do still consider myself to be a practitioner and a reluctant academic. And if you've not looked into the work of Clance and Imes on imposter syndrome, that's basically me. And if ever you found yourself in a room, or perhaps delivering a keynote at a conference on a Saturday to an international audience, you might have suddenly considered, how on earth have I ended up here? So it's that positionality, that personal context, which has really framed the things. And I'm now ready to move on to my next slide. Okay, so the original research context, because this research took place before the pandemic, but it's something that's really been going over in my mind considerably in the last 12 months. So I've already talked to you about the fact that I was very much about voice and advocacy in terms of children. I started reading much more broadly around it. It was the focus of my master's dissertation. And I looked at children as experts in their own lives. I used Clark and Moss's mosaic approach, their multitude of listening methods that I've mentioned on my slide, and you've got the NCB book picture there. And I listened to the children, and I tried all the different ways that Clark and Moss talk about in terms of listening to children. We talked to we listened to their voice. We enabled them to do photography and tell stories through photographs and to create maps of their setting, and then we talked to their parents and we talked to key workers, and the whole nursery that I was working with at the time got thoroughly involved with developing mosaics around individual children, and it was great and I loved it. But I did that as an extra. I wasn't part and parcel of ratios in the nursery setting at that time, and it struck me that it was a lot of work. So when I wanted to extend this research further, I wanted to really consider how this could be done in a real life context. What were the realities of daily practice? I was a practitioner at heart, and I needed a way of researching children's voice initially, that was real. And you've got an image taken top left, not one of my favourites, but when we give the children the cameras, you have to take what comes out at the other end. So you can tell that that's very squarely been taken by one of the children who's documenting their daily experience in their nursery. But the question that's at the bottom of this slide and the fingers in the ears image, I was struck instantly through all of this research who was actually listening to the practitioners, who was listening to the teachers, and where was their voice in all this. So I'd gone in incredibly passionately about listening to the children, but I was increasingly alarmed, really, by, in some contexts, the lack of listening opportunities, if you like, for those practitioners, for the teachers, for the staff that were supporting children in this early years context. So that provided additional motivation for me to really start exploring how I was going to interact with practitioners in early years as a researcher, and how I was going to be able to support their continuing professional development. So as all good researchers do, I went off and had a good old rummage in the literature. And the first thing really that struck me was that most of the literature that actually pertains to professional development and models of learning are squarely focused on teachers, and teachers in a variety of contexts: primary, secondary, further and higher education. But it really did take an extra bit of digging. Oh, hello. I'm just going to take back control. Not to worry, these things are sent to testers. It really did take some digging for me to be able to find enough information around specifically early years practice, and I'll come on to the specifics of early years. So one of the helpful models that I just wanted to share with you and really invite your reflections on, because this will be quite interesting, and see what you all have to say about it in the chat. Kennedy has produced a model. She's actually refined it a couple of times. 2014 is the most recent version of the model, and she talks about all the different styles and ways that we can engage in professional development. And I know those of you sitting in the audience through this rather transmissive style of delivery here, which is why I'm inviting your chat, will have had experience of a number of these. And what Kennedy did was she popped it all onto this continuum, starting from those most transmissive opportunities, such as your training days, things like your paediatric first aid, you know, your food hygiene standards, those statutory requirements. She talks about deficit models of professional development. And just by the nature of the title, you can tell that what's coming isn't necessarily positive or good. Deficit being it's what you don't have. So please, could you do whatever you need to do in order to then have this particular attribute, skill or requirement. The cascade model was always an interesting one to me when I was in teaching. Here's a little bit of knowledge and information for you. Oh, it's happening again. Somebody's helping themselves to my slides. the cascade model is very much around, if I pass a little piece of information on to you, you can take it back to your setting and you can pass it around to everybody in your setting. And I've engaged in a number of training opportunities. I can remember going to see the head. I'd love to go on this particular training day. Well, that's okay, you can do it, but as long as you come back and do a staff meeting and pass on that information to everybody else. But all of those are actually based on quite an old-fashioned view, in my opinion, of how we actually learn. It doesn't really acknowledge the way we know children learn. It doesn't acknowledge that we construct learning and that we build it for ourselves. And that's what we embed in our pedagogy, and that's how we work with our children. We work with our children to ensure that they can construct their own knowledge. And yet actually quite a lot of the training and the professional development that we engage in then just completely doesn't take that into account at all, and goes back to a much more transmissive mode. Here's the information, now you've got it, so now you have it. I only wish that my year 6 class, when they were delivering their SATs, when we were having SATs, it was that simple. There you go, I've told it you, so now you know it. No problem at all, 100% all round. Kennedy then talks about a malleable section. Basically, it's starting to get a little bit more flexible in this kind of part of her continuum. So she talks about awards and standards bearing models, things like developing against a set of standards as you move towards a particular goal, the early years teaching awards, your level 3 qualifications. So those standards that exist at the end of a period of time, and you develop a set of evidence are based in awards bearing models. And she does recognise that those also now can be a little bit more flexible and do have a little bit more of an opportunity for reflective practice and those sort of effective mechanisms within them. The thing to point out, though, particularly with Kennedy's model, is that collaborative models that are truly collaborative, that have the most professional agency, that really do and are driven by the person that's involved in the professional development themselves, driven by them, those have the most transformative effect and actually the most lasting effect. So I found this model particularly interesting when I got hold of it, and I reflected on it actually in light of my opportunities in early years and my opportunities in primary, and concluded really that much of the training that I had experienced had been at that transmissive side of things, and hadn't necessarily enabled me, any professional agency hadn't enabled me to sort of take control of my own learning and development and to move things forward. Okay. So considering professional development in light of early years, and I'm picking up from the chat that there's one or two of you that are struggling to see the slides. I'm not normally a reader of slides, but I will just make sure I mention the main points on this next slide, just in case there are some of you that actually can't see it, don't have the visual in front of you. So thinking about professional development squarely in relation to early years. Think about early years first of all. We haven't got time. It's a we've only got an hour. The Helen Perkins in her doctoral thesis talked about the complex patchwork in early years. Early years as a sector is so incredibly diverse in terms of just all of the different elements. You can be a childminder working in your own home, or you can be an enormous, great big multi-academy trust with nursery provision within it and your sort of reception provision. So the mix that happens in early years is much more diverse than I ever found in primary. And don't get me wrong, primary education is incredibly diverse in its own right. Our sector is not readily the domain of the postgraduate professional. There are a number of you here today who are postgraduate professionals in early years, but actually that's not indicative of our sector as a whole. And actually what's happened most recently, and there's another piece of CREC work cited there, the 2020 review, is that the drive for the graduate workforce that we know and that research tells us really, really effective. We know that that has stalled most recently. It's stalled in terms of austerity measures, and has it stalled further in light of COVID? Only time will tell for us all with that one. The statutory framework around those of us working in England, and that the English context is really the only context that I can talk in terms of depth of professional experience. The statutory requirements in there are often around training. They're around requirements to have certificates in terms of sort of health, safety, compliance elements of early years provision. To be fair, the early years foundation stage does also recognise the need for supervision and the potential and the requirement to supervise work in early years. So you could be moving into a mentoring and coaching model. It was on Kennedy's continuum on the previous slide, but largely as a sector, we are exposed to fairly standard training, traditional experiences in terms of professional development. We've got further reviews around reduced professional development opportunities on the whole as a result of the austerity measures. Again, that is pre-COVID. It is a pre-COVID report, but it certainly talks about the reduced availability of local authority support as an example. So I would argue that in early years, we do need a specific approach in terms of professional development. And I think with such a diverse sector, we do have something quite different and special that we can offer in terms of professional development. Okay, and this is pedagogic mediation. This is what I want to talk to you about today. So pedagogic mediation, I would argue, comes right at the most transformative end of Kennedy's spectrum continuum of professional development, and it is based originally, as you can see from the slide, of the work of Julia and João Formancino, who are based in Portugal. They work as part of an organisation called the Childhood Association, and they are involved in what's technically, I suppose, an alternative pedagogical approach in Portugal, which is called pedagogy, in participation. Now, they use pedagogic mediation as for the development of all of their staff that they call teachers. Okay, so in Portugal, if you're working in early years, you are called a teacher. Now, it's through democratic and participatory practice, and I'll come on to what that can look like in just a moment. But the thing I want to just flag at this point is that it's situated. It is in the context, in the setting. Okay, it's not going out for the day. It's actually not sitting on a Teams or a Zoom call on a Saturday morning. It's situated. Okay, so we'll come back to that shortly as well. It is very much bound by the context of the situation that you're in and the time that you're in. There is definitely an understanding that things are going to change over time. Okay, so what they have in Portugal at the Childhood Association is they have pedagogic mediators. They have people who are situated, who are based within the nursery, the preschool provision, slightly older age group that it extends to in Portugal. They don't go to school quite as early as we do. But there are people there, permanently mediators, pedagogic mediators, who are going to mediate the pedagogy. They're going to act as a bit of a go-between and enable development for those staff. But this truly is at the very flexible and transformative end of Kennedy's continuum of professional development. So some principles of pedagogic mediation, because in my view, and during and post COVID, I think I believe pedagogic mediation has something to offer us all. So it's ethical and it's honest. Okay, as a pedagogic mediator working with settings, sorry, that was actually my fault that time. You are honest about who you are and the experiences that you have. Okay, you don't ask things of people when they're not in a position to give them to you. I went in and worked with settings as part of my research, and they knew who I was. They knew that I was a postgraduate researcher. They knew that I'd got a teaching qualification. They knew that I'd got a master's in education, and they were all okay with that. I also presented to them as a student of theirs, and I was there to learn, and I enabled them to direct what we were doing and the developments that we were making in the settings. So in that respect, it was non-hierarchical and it was democratic. I did not present myself as an expert. I didn't turn up and say, I am the expert and I'm here to tell you all what to do. Would be my least comfortable position to be in. I turned up and I was honest, and I said, this is who I am and these are the experiences that I have. This is how I've worked previously with the local authority. This is the support that I've delivered to other settings before. These are the areas that I might be able to help you with. Can you help me? Are there areas that you can help me in terms of my own research and the way that I think about this? So it's rooted in praxis itself. It's rooted in the setting. It takes time. This is not your one-day training opportunity. This is about developing relationships over a period of time. It also recognises that everybody's going to be on a different time schedule. Not everybody is ready to shift, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The other word that's on this slide is isomorphic, and don't be frightened of isomorphism. Isomorphism is something I want to get you all to think about today. It's something that's really important to me in terms of pedagogy and pedagogic mediation. Isomorphism essentially means that the mode of learning works every which way. So the way I work as a pedagogic mediator with practitioners in the early years, so if it's honest and respectful and non-hierarchical, and if it's democratic and participatory, then they will work with that way with the children. You're almost modelling the pedagogy, you're modelling the way to be. And isomorphism suggests that learning in one way works as it works for the staff, it works for the children in the same way. So we take the principles of learning from them and we apply it in a different situation, very much like I reflected in terms of the training model. We appreciate that children construct their own learning. Do we offer staff, do we allow staff to construct their own learning too, or do we just give them a list of things we think they should know? Okay, there are some elements of pedagogic mediation, and it's these elements that I'm going to draw on again as well at the end in terms of reconsidering this in light of COVID. Openness is very much about just being open to what's happening in the setting. It's getting to know areas of practice in that particular context and space that you might not have known before. So we are in a COVID time at the minute, but are you open to all of the practice that's around you? Are you open to what's happening in other situations? I'd suggest that all of you are, because you're all here today. So you're all open to learning new things. Openness for me when I was in the settings was very much about me just observing really the routines and rhythms and the interactions of the day, and it was also about me asking reactive sorts of questions. Things would happen and I would just ask questions to sort of clarify and to better my understanding about the setting itself. As a pedagogic mediator, I then moved into a listening space where I listened more to the people around, and I asked more proactive questions to sort of tell me a little bit more about why this looks like that, or why you know, this transition's happened in this particular way. So listening moved me into a little bit more of a proactive state as a pedagogic mediator. Suspending is something else that I want you all to take with you today. Suspending is where you will need to pause. It's a pause button. The icon that I selected for suspending was a pause button, because at times there will be tensions. Practice will develop in a particular way, or you'll see things that aren't necessarily completely in tune with your own fundamental pedagogic ideas, and you'll have to stop and take a moment, because we can't take everybody on the same journey at exactly the same rate. And so suspending will involve you just holding, pausing and waiting. It's not to say that you ignore and that you don't deal with things that need consideration, but it is to say that you just, it can wait, it can be suspended, it can just be paused for a little while, and we'll come back to that another time. Encountering happens after you've spent time and you've built relationships with these people, and encountering is where you start to have that raised consciousness. For those of you that are aware of Paulo Freire and the work of Freire in terms of a raised critical consciousness, you start to really think about why you're doing what you're doing, and actually at its deepest level, encountering happens when you also really start to have a greater confidence in your own expertise, your own awareness and confidence in your field, and you start to question some of the maybe guidelines or policies that are around you, and you might just start to reconsider why you do things in the way that you do them. An example of an encountering opportunity that I had with some practitioners that I was working very, very closely with was when they reconsidered how they were planning. And essentially, and in a very small nutshell, they were writing things down in about 4 places. And they were doing it because they thought it was what Ofsted, our quality assurance measure in England, it was thought it was what Ofsted wanted. So once we really engaged in some critical dialogue around it and unpicked who was benefiting from this paperwork, the practitioners really started to reconsider how they recorded the planning, and moved to a much more in the moment style that some of you will have heard of. So those are the elements of pedagogic mediation. Now, we're here to consider things in light of COVID and, you know, the challenging times that are around us and the challenges that this has brought to practice. And I mean, this slide really has just got 6, 7, 8 screen grabs of some of the headlines that are out there at the moment about the challenge of us being in settings at the moment. Now, I'm in my living room. I've pretty much been in my living room since March. I've interacted with many of you that are with us today on the call, and yeah, you're all very familiar with the background, and you know exactly where I am. My heart goes out, and I have friends and colleagues currently in the sector, and I think we are in a position where we really need to think very, very carefully about the support we are putting in place really broadly for practitioners, for teachers, and for our sector. I think, as the abstract that I wrote for today's presentation said, we all gave a great deal of time and consideration and thought to how we would welcome children and families back after lockdown. We've all gone out of our way to think about the well-being of the children. There's been all sorts of dialogue around whether children have actually missed out and whether it should be a catch-up curriculum when they get back, or whether we should be focusing on health and well-being. And I would just today like to encourage us all to think about the staff and to think about the well-being of the staff and how we can be supporting them in this very, very difficult time. How do we manage context-based professional development when we're in bubbles and we are now working in an increasingly isolated way? We've got much more stress and workload. I've talked already about things taking time. We get daily briefings on policy, daily updates to just keep on top of in terms of shifting health and safety requirements. We are very much on a reactive trajectory at the moment, and I'm not sure we can do anything to stop that, if I'm honest. We are reacting to the global situation, and I'm not suggesting that we do, but are there any opportunities for us to become a little bit more proactive in supporting the staff that are out there, and not to have such a narrow vision of we need a staff development day because we just need to get up to date with our COVID procedures, which, don't get me wrong, are incredibly important, but I think time and space needs to be given to how we're also supporting the staff more broadly. And I do think pedagogic mediation can offer us some ideas as to how that might work. I think openness suggests making sure you are connected and you have communities of practice. For those of you that know the work of Lev and Wenger in terms of communities of practice, they're fabulous. It's one of those things that CREC is built on. Absolutely. You've all joined together today as a broader community of practice, and you've all been introducing yourselves to one another in the chat. You clearly are all open to being part of that community. Have you been able to bring anybody with you in terms of your openness? Have you been able to make those connections in your settings? Are you able to encourage others to have those connections and to be open to one another? Are we taking time to listen to each other at the minute? I suspect we're not, and it's because we are reacting to the situation that's unfolding on us all. But I do think we all need to take some time, and even if that means protecting time where we will just listen to one another. In moving our training spaces and in moving to an online platform, which is perfectly possible. You've got an image to the left there. We've all connected in this way today. Colleagues at eSera were connecting just a few weeks ago internationally, bringing people together. But what we're missing, and what I talked about right at the beginning, is that we didn't all stand around in a lobby and have a coffee, and we won't all have breakout spaces after this. And actually, I'm not able to look into the whites of your eyes to see whether you're nodding off to sleep or whether you're surfing Facebook on another tab or any of those things. And I think there is something to be said about making sure we have the ability to listen and time and space to listen. And in the rush to get us all online and connected in that way, it's making sure there's room for that. And it was really fabulous actually when I spoke to Tracy and Zita about the conference today, that it was very much going to be about time and space for questions, which we'll come on to in a minute, and to be able to have that dialogue and to be able to connect you all through the chat. It isn't the same, but it's a small step towards being able to listen to the people that are participating in the room. Suspending. I'm not going to get overly political now, but I do think we need to be suspending some of the things that would ordinarily be taking place at the moment. I think that our sector isn't in a position to be scrutinised through quality assurance mechanisms at the moment, and I think things like that should be suspended. And in suspending, we should be allowing an understanding that some people just are not in a space to be able to move against last year's development plan and targets and so on and so forth. So I think the need to suspend, and actually suspending for me is incredibly useful, and I often have moments in dialogue with practitioners, and you know, there'll be a comment about a particular, I don't know, take something like systematic synthetic phonics. I often find myself in a position where I have to suspend my own values and beliefs. Let me just gain control back because somebody's just taken my PowerPoint off me. Okay. Okay, well, hopefully that'll pop back my way. Okay, not sure what I can do about that, not to worry. Okay, so suspending anyway. I think we're in a difficult time and space at the minute, and I think suspending is going to be the way to ensure that we are able to listen to people as we go. I'm going to try reopening the PowerPoint again for you all. Listen to people as we go and enable us to pop our judgments to one side at the moment, and just acknowledge that we're not all doing this at the same rate and space and time. Right. Okay. Oh, which takes us to encountering. Okay, we have got lots of lessons to learn, and in being open and listening to these much broader communities of practice, we are going to be able to move forward out of the space and situation that we are in, if we're given the time to be able to think about it and to move our practice forward. So just a couple of final messages for you all, really. Do remember a little about isomorphism. Okay, isomorphism rules. Okay, it grants voice and agency to practitioners and children alike. Okay, which makes the space much more respectful. Okay, it ensures agency and participation. If you're going to follow children's interests, where are the staff's interests? If you're going to listen to your children and consider maybe your UNCRC, your rights of your child, where are the staff involved in this, and where are they able to do that? Gosh, somebody keeps grabbing my PowerPoint. Okay, the other key message that I want you to take away today is that practitioners are experts in their own context. Okay, this acknowledges something that Chris and Tony have talked about previously, and you'll be hearing from them a little later in terms of wise practice. Okay, the motivation for change does come from inside us, and the motivation and passion to find out more comes from inside us. Okay, so it isn't professional development, it isn't always about a set of standards and a tick list that sit at the end of an accredited period, but there are ways in which we can be motivated to bring our own experiences forward, to own our own experiences, to recognise that we do all have something to bring. You will all know your setting and your context much better than anybody else, and even the practitioner that works in the next room to you, you will still know your context better than they will. So absolutely a take-home message from today is that practitioners are experts in their own context and should be enabled to drive the direction of their own professional development. There's a list of references that I'm very happy to share for those of you that require additional reading for your Saturday afternoon and for the end of your lockdown. And if you are interested in reading a little more about it, very specifically about pedagogic mediation, there is a chapter in this book here, which is edited by Mike Gasper and Rosie Walker. And I've popped the link to it here from Bloomsbury Books. And I don't get any commission, by the way. Also, I have a journal article out that I was supported in writing from Zita and from Chris and Tony, who you'll be hearing from later, as they've supervised the research. And just to provide a little thread and a little connective tissue for you all, in terms of what I've learned about pedagogic mediation and bringing these connections online, the project that you're going to hear about later, in which Chris and Tony are going to talk to you about children's responses to COVID. I've actually been a researcher as part of that project and used some of my pedagogic mediation skills in connecting with researchers who incidentally are in New Zealand rather than being in the UK. So I've been able to provide the openness, the listening, the suspending and the encountering, even though it has been online. Thank you all very much for listening. I think Zita's already asked you if you've got any questions to pop them in the chat, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We haven't had any questions in the chat yet. If anybody has
silence.
Sorry?
Stunned silence.
Oh, sorry, it's okay. I'm getting quite a lot of feedback, so I can hear my own voice as I'm talking. It's a little bit concerning. So if anybody does have any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat, and me and Tracy can have a look at them and start to ask Helen, or if you would prefer to come on and ask the question yourself, please do so, because I think we can manage that with the amount of people that are on here. One of the questions I had, Helen, actually, while we're having a look at the chat, obviously you've done this for your thesis, you've used pedagogic mediation. Could you just give some examples of your own use of it, in the sense of how you've experienced it and what you were able to do in using it in your research?
Yeah, definitely, Zita. It was so I looked at how we listen to children. That passion that you got from me at the beginning, around wanting to be an advocate for children. That's what I went into it to do. So I worked alongside 3 settings and looked at how they listened to children. So that we just looked at their sort of daily practice and daily pedagogy, and we looked at how we could tweak, perhaps just shift practice so that children's interests were much more at the heart of what was happening there. And actually what happened was that the settings that I was working with all went in very, very different directions with it, which is what should happen. So we had one setting that very much went down a family voice route and really wanted to develop how they were involving the parents more. And I had one setting that really got excited about pedagogic documentation and documenting the children's journeys and involving the children in that documentation. So giving the children the cameras and enabling children to tell their own stories of their time in nursery and in preschool. So but equally, a setting that I worked with slightly longer ago, they decided to use that method and work on that in relation to their outdoor environment. So they worked with the children and the practitioners in a very participatory way, and reconsidered the outdoor environment. So it doesn't have to be about everything, and it can be quite a narrow focus that you can take that approach with. I think the world is your oyster. I do think we need to just think about professional development. I think professional development in early years is enormous. I think that requires thought and consideration and time. And I think moving away from a transmissive model of just come and get your certificate and do a day, and we just need you to have, and don't get me wrong, first aid is incredibly important, and I'm by no means suggesting that that's not a requirement, and it certainly is a requirement, but I'm suggesting that as early years practitioners, we are worth so much more.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, there are some questions in the chat. I think one of them was, do you think that the in the moment approach works well within this approach? I think is what Rachel was asking.
Yeah, certainly. The one setting that I worked with moved towards that in the moment approach to planning, using floor books to document the group progress through it, and to sort of have some documentation of the learning journey, if you like. But it's really the thing about pedagogic mediation is that it was about where the practitioners wanted to go themselves. They recognised that planning wasn't working for them. They were writing continuous provision plans. They were writing specific group plans. They were then writing plans for individual children. And I'm sure this will resonate with some of you out there. And they were literally writing the same thing in 3 or 4 different spaces. And it just took a question as part of one of my encounters there one day. And said, oh, you just, and it was a practitioner very stressed about how much time was available to her, and I've got to do this, and I've got to write that over there. And I said, okay, I said, the same thing, you're writing the same thing, but just in a different folder. Yeah, it has to go there, because that's the folder for this, for the individual plans, and that's the folder for the group plans. And I was like, right, okay. And it has to be like that, because, and it's about practitioners not having confidence to say, actually, why am I doing it like that? What else is out there? Where can I get some more ideas, and who can I connect with about it? So yeah, for them, it worked, and they were very happy.
We have another comment, and it is about the shift in the qualifications, and whether or not perhaps we can use that pedagogic mediation to dig more into that. And also, oh, somebody said, I still struggle in understanding how to merge individual and classroom plans, which is in response to what you've just said.
Yeah, I think Tracy, qualifications more broadly in the sector, I think really if you've got 3 days, 4 days, a
Yes,
week,
yeah.
I mean a whole thesis. It's I think for me, coming out of primary and everything being relatively equal, if you like, and fairly easy to navigate in terms of, in order to be a teacher, this is what you need. I think in terms of early years practice and the levels and layers of qualification, I just think we've got a bit of a sort of a hodgepodge here, there and everywhere. We've got different requirements. I mean, ultimately, money's at the bottom end of this entire discussion, isn't it? Because actually the finances involved, I voluntarily decided to undertake doctoral research. Yes, I know. Yes, but there we go. But my time and space, I spent a very long time with these practitioners, a very long time. Actually, in terms of the daily rate of an advisor, is that possible? Actually, no, probably isn't. But I do think there are ways that there are practitioners in settings who are already engaging in this way of being. There is always the person in the room that's got a little bit more confidence with this area and a little bit more confidence with that area. And because in early years we are so reluctant to see ourselves as experts, we're all very happy to say children are experts in their own lives. Well, let me tell you, practitioners are experts in their own context. And that's what I think we need to take hold of and recognise. And we're not experts at everything. And none of us would pertain to be an expert about everything. But I would hope if a group of us got together, we could each bring something unique. That isomorphism, the things that we know are true of the children. Yeah, the unique child. Yeah, we've got the unique practitioner. We need to acknowledge that isomorphism is there.
We've got a few more, there's comments, but also questions as well. I think people are concerned about the community of practice for students in terms of the current climate, and also thinking about, do you think that the earliest practitioners will ever get the recognition of teachers? And already there is very low morale. Practitioners do not get seen as teachers, if that makes sense. And yes, it does, Rachel.
No, I agree with Rachel as well. I think we've had some shift. It takes massive events, doesn't it? Global pandemic. And I do think we've seen a bit of a shift towards certain sectors of our society. Key worker status was a biggie for me. Recognition that you are a key worker and you are absolutely instrumental in what's going on. To be honest, the news over the last couple of days that teachers are going to be amongst the public sector workers that are not going to be getting pay increments in terms of our financial response, if you like, in the long term. And don't get me wrong, I totally appreciate, and I'm certainly not putting myself forward to be treasurer of the United Kingdom in any way, shape or form. But I think you've got paying conditions at the bottom of all of this as well. Do I think early years practitioners will get recognition as teachers? At the moment, I don't, because I don't think there's the money to do it. I don't think we put, as a society, enough money and funding into early years. The work that I've done with Portugal has illustrated that to me tenfold, in that the fees, if you like, that families were contributing was an absolute drop in the ocean compared to the fees that I knew and that I know I've paid over the years. In terms of my own 2 children, I know I was paying more than a mortgage when both of my children were under 5 in terms of my own contribution to their childcare and education. So I think until we can fund the sector adequately, I don't think we're going to get parity over levels of qualifications, because I don't think with the current funding model that earlier settings can afford to pay teachers' paying conditions and to acknowledge teachers' paying conditions. Do I think that's the way forward? Yes, I do. Have we got the money at the moment? No, we probably haven't.
Helen, can I read this comment to you, please, if that's okay, just to have your response? It says, for me, I'm concerned about the impact of the pandemic on those settings. and practitioners that were becoming more open to new pedagogical approaches and making positive steps. But once inspections return, there'll be a sense of panic and perhaps reverting to old ways.
Yeah, I don't think we've got our quality assurance mechanisms right anyway, regardless of global pandemic. I don't think quality assurance should be a stick to beat you with, sorry to use such a dreadful metaphor with it. I think it should be a supportive and rewarding experience, and I know that generally that's not how we experience it. Again, I'm going to go back to practitioners being experts in their own context and being confident. I've experienced quite a number of inspections, and I have worked alongside practitioners who lack confidence. That imposter syndrome that I mentioned way back at the beginning seems to rear its head in early years quite a lot, and across the board. And I certainly think we all suffer from that when Ofsted come knocking at the door. And I think confidence and articulating and defending what you do is part and parcel of a visit and an inspection. I think if you've started to shift into new and innovative pedagogic ways, own it, know it, be confident about it, and maybe if necessary, and if inspections are going to continue and that's completely out of our hands, then rehearse it and be confident in how you articulate your message to those that are going to be making that judgment. Get the parents on board, demonstrate your positive outcomes for children, and really, who can argue about the practice? I mean, there are alternative pedagogic approaches do well in terms of inspection framework, so I wouldn't let that make you rush back to a more traditional model necessarily. But I think we need to grow some confidence in the sector, and I think that would help that. But in my personal view, I don't think inspections should be taking place at the moment. And actually, can I just come back, sorry Tracy, to just one of the comments from before that you made? So you talked about students and sort of not being able to take students with us in terms of that professional development and qualifications at the moment. I think that's a really, really massive issue, certainly in the work that I'm doing at CREC. In terms of, we run a school-centred initial teacher training programme, and trying to juggle that during a pandemic when I've had to move the learning online has been incredibly difficult. I am a very, very firm believer in the community of practice, and I know they'd use that terminology in the comment that you read to me. For me, there is still a way of building a community of practice online, but it just takes time and consideration, and to be honest, a little bit of extra effort and a bit of silliness. One of those last slides that I shared with you all was a picture of me wearing a really ridiculous pair of Christmas pajamas about 2 weeks ago, because we connected with our trainees and we had a pajama day, and I joked with them all. It's a professional course, so I'm afraid, and this might get several responses from your chat, but for me it was, you will attend and you will be there in person, so I want cameras on, okay, because it's a professional program that we're delivering, and I'm afraid I don't want you to be in bed. I want you to be up and dressed, and you know, I want a professional interaction with you. It's a professional program, so we did spend a day in our pajamas for sillies, and I think it's making sure you have that space. We build reflective space into our program, and it's not nearly enough in my view at the moment, and I need to find a time and space for more, but it is about making sure. I talked about the fact that we can't all go and have a coffee outside in a minute and have some general chit chat, and we're going to miss that, and we are all going to miss it, but by enabling the chat, by enabling connections in that way, we are going to go some way to achieving that. And do you know what? I think technology will catch us up and we'll get better at it. You know, the platform that we're on now and the likes of Zoom and things, we can get smaller groups together. We can look at each other and have a chat in real time. And I think that's a difference. We've retained, I would say I've retained face-to-face connections. And that's what I wish to carry on retaining, face-to-face in my living room.
Tracy, can we take this comment next, if that's okay? In relation to it, if I read it to you, in relation to what you said, Ari, the issue about having an outside pedagogic mediator, as we are all reflective practitioners in the early years, could each practitioner with their own expertise adopt the pedagogic mediator role at different points to support learning and reflection in action and enable others to construct their own learning?
Love it, Zita. Yes, absolutely. And what I'd say is, particularly, I mean, I worked with several settings using this approach, but there was one setting in particular that really got themselves to a point that where I would say the staff were all, the practitioners in there were all being the mediator at various times and spaces. And I'd say what it offers is that flexibility, going back to that model, Kennedy's model and continuum of professional development in terms of how well it all works. The most flexible approach is the more successful in terms of long-term and lasting change. So actually, if you can recognise that, you know, Zita's got a particular passion for this particular area, and Tracy's going to bring a different slant from a different area, and then I'm going to look at it from a different perspective, then yes, there would be a way. And you could adopt the approach of pedagogic mediation as a whole setting and support one another's professional development over quite a systematic plan. You could look together in a participatory way as a staff team, think about the advances that you want to make in your setting, make sure everybody gets a little bit involved, ask the children what they think, get the children involved and hear their voice, and get them involved in where the learning and development might go in the future.
Just looking at some of the other chats there.
We have one here on I work as a childcare teacher in further education. Sadly, many settings have had to close within the area where I teach due to the pandemic, and we have some students who still cannot get into a placement. This is so sad and concerns me for the children within the local area and CC professionals who are now unemployed. As a previous practitioner, as a teacher, I worry how these students will be able to gain knowledge and expertise as students linking theory to practice.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I go back to Zita, that we actually need to change our view of the importance of this sector, and it needs more financial support, but it also needs more support generally in society. We need a campaign. I might see what Marcus Rashford's up to for the next few weeks and see if we can get him spearheading sort of early years professionals as his next campaign, because that's been very, very successful indeed, hasn't it? So I do think we need, if there was greater understanding across society of how important the work is in early years, then actually we wouldn't have difficulties finding placements, because we would understand how very, very important that we get our students in, and they are able to make those links between theory and practice. Certainly in terms of initial teacher education, and this is where it isn't fair, and this is where we get a difference in terms of hierarchical status across different areas of education more broadly. But initial teacher education, we now have key worker status, and there was extra consideration given to those as teachers. So early years staff, practitioners, teachers, whatever word and term you wish to use, do also have key worker status. Has it been made clear to students that that status could be extended to them depending on the length of their placement and their involvement in the setting? And actually, settings are hemorrhaging staff at the moment. And certainly in terms of all of the settings that I work with, they have welcomed placement students with open arms, and our placement students, bless them, I was online with them all yesterday morning. They are exhausted. They are working incredibly hard. They are learning lots. They are going to be such resilient teachers and practitioners in the long term because of what they're experiencing now. But gosh, they certainly needed what we call their CREC day yesterday, to have a bit of downtime, but they've been welcomed with open arms. My own children, as an aside, are currently engaging in home learning completely because so many teachers at their school have COVID or are that the school can't even run at the moment. So I think we need to make sure that our students are seen as trainees, are seen as associates. Some organisations use, again, we get a little bit tied up in the terminology, but they certainly need the status to be able to engage. There are some absolutely fabulous practitioners out there in terms of our student population, and if we can get them in and get them helping at the moment, then we should be welcoming that, really.
Can I add to that as well, Helen, because it's quite interesting you're talking about different status, but at the moment what we have is a government initiative to support early careers teachers. So within the first 2 years of their newly qualified, to have that support and mentoring. And I think that that may be as well something that needs to be adopted in terms of those smaller CPD bites. That's the online opportunities for people to develop a community of practice with others, so that we can kind of develop opportunities for solution-based approaches. And I think that that would fit in very much with what you were talking about the experts then sharing that as well. So from obviously, as we're hosting this at the moment, that is certainly something that the university would be very interested in knowing if people would be very, would like that sort of thing. Because I think, Zita, perhaps that's something that we could develop from this as well, in terms of what things could we do to support students that are perhaps not as advantaged, not disadvantaged potentially, but not having the same experience this year as before.
Yes.
I think we have got some lovely questions in the chat, but I'm very conscious of time now. I wonder, Helen, if it's okay with you, if perhaps you've got the opportunity, you might be able to go through and answer any others, if that would be okay.
Yes, certainly. It'd be lovely for me to have the chance to get into the chat.
Yes, no, I know. And I was going to suggest that if it's okay with everybody, we have a 15-minute break. Just grab a cup of coffee and a comfort break, and we'll be back here for 12:30. I'll stop the recording at this bit, so that this bit then is recorded as a section on its own. Somebody's asked in the chat about this. I will get the recording sent out to people that have registered through the Eventbrite, and also that it will be available in the chat. So you'll be able to see it by coming back and revisiting this again through the link. So hopefully that will be available for everybody. So see you back here at 12:30, if that's okay. Yes. And I'll be hanging around because I've just had my coffee delivered.
Can we ask though that you stay on the link, if that's okay? So just stay muted with your camera off, but stay on rather than go out of the meeting and back in. That would be great.
Wonderful. I just press I'll stop recording.